Today, let's look at one more dimension of how to read a balance sheet. As you're all aware, a balance sheet has two sides, the liabilities and the assets. And the liabilities represent where the money has come from, and the assets tell you what you did with the money. Point to be kept in mind is, none of the sources of money fall into a category called gift. They are all liability. And what does a liability mean? A liability means any person who has given you the money today is the same person who's going to be standing outside your door sometime or the other saying, I want it back. And how will you give it back? You've taken this money and deployed it to buy the assets. And therefore, in the interest of sustainability, in the interest of financial viability, it is essential that when you invest this money to buy the assets, invest it in such a way that the assets will bring the money back before the liabilities come asking for it back. Now keep this in mind. How do you read a balance sheet? Folks, if you wish to read a balance sheet, I will give you a few steps. Step number one, pick up a balance sheet. Folks, if you pick up a real life balance sheet, you might find that there are several sources and several uses appearing on that. But if you study each of them, you'll be able to identify all the sources to be by nature either long-term or short-term. When is a source called long-term source? Any money coming in that doesn't have to be returned within a year is called long-term, and if the liability will mature in less than a year, it would be short-term. Similarly, your assets can be broken up into those that bring the money back within a year and those that will not. Which assets will not bring the money back within a year? They are called fixed assets. The land, the building, the machine. Why will they not bring the money back? Because you didn't buy them for sale, you bought them for use. But the assets that appear under a heading called current assets, which represent working capital, will actually bring the money back usually in less than a year, in a few months in fact. In fact, the working capital is called the working capital cycle or a cash to cash cycle. Now, if you wish to read a balance sheet, I suggest reclassify your liabilities into two types, long-term and short-term, and your assets can similarly be classified as long-term and short-term. Folks, if you do this, and maybe you pick up 100 balance sheets, go on the internet tonight and download 100 balance sheets and do this. On the sources side, bring them down to two, long-term sources, short-term sources. User side, bring them down to two, long-term users, short-term users. If you do this to even 100 balance sheets, you are now going to discover every balance sheet or whichever balance sheet you're holding in your hands, you will be able to recognize that balance sheet to be either type A or B or C. There are only three types of balance sheets in the world. And what do these three balance sheets look like? Here is what they look like. Type A looks like this, type B looks like this, and type C looks like this. Now watch these three balance sheets carefully and tell me, what do I mean every balance sheet has to look like this? If you are familiar with your own balance sheet, you'll be thinking right now, Anil, mine looks very different. So what do I mean when I say every balance sheet has to be type A, B or C? When will I call a balance sheet type A? When will I call it B? When will I call it C? What is the characteristic of each of these three types of balance sheets? Folks, how are you looking at them? Are you looking at these balance sheets vertically or are you looking at them horizontally? If you're looking at them vertically, don't. Look at them horizontally. And now you realize the relevance the significance does not lie in 80-20, it lies in 80-80. And it doesn't matter if it's 80 on the top and 20 on the bottom or 20 on the top and 80 on the bottom. So long as whatever is written against long-term sources is the same as long-term uses, whatever is written as short-term sources is the same as short-term uses, we will call it type A. If the long-term sources are greater than long-term uses and short-term are lesser than short-term uses, we will call it B. And if the long term are less and short term are more, we will call the balance sheet type C. Do you agree? There cannot be a fourth type of balance sheet. Folks, as usual, I have shown you two-digit numbers. I have frozen the asset side. It is easy to recognize. Real life will have more complicated numbers. I want to make sure, will you still be able to recognize? So I'm going to show you three more. Real life balance sheet will look like this, isn't it? And imagine there are many zeros after each number. Now can you recognize which is A, which is B, which is C? The middle one seems to be A. The first one, long-term sources are less than long-term users. Short-term are more than short-term users. Type C. First is C, second is A, third is B. Now folks, we need to learn how to read a balance sheet. Can you watch these three balance sheets carefully and tell me which is the healthiest of them all? Reach a conclusion, keep it in your mind, then when I give you my analysis, you can compare it with that. Tell me, how do I describe the first company? How much long-term money do they have? 80. How much is the long-term utilization? 80. How much short-term money do they have? 20. Use 20. I think it's fair enough to say this company has used the long-term money and acquired the long-term assets, and they use the short-term money to acquire the short-term assets. A can be described as a company that has used the long-term funds for long-term purposes and the short-term funds for short-term purposes. What about B? How much long-term money do they have? 90. And how much is the utilization? 80. It looks like all the long-term assets are funded from long-term sources and they have a surplus of 10. So far as short term is concerned, money available is 10, utilization is 20. Even if all the short term money went into buying the short term asset, they're running short of 10. So how did they bridge the gap? They have a surplus on the long term front. That long term surplus must have been diverted to buy the short term assets. B can be described as a company that has used a portion of long term funds for short term purposes. What about C? How much long-term money do they have? 70. How much is the utilization? 80. Even if all the long-term money went into buying the long-term assets, they're running short of 10. But so far as short-term is concerned, they have 10 extra. This money seems to have been diverted for buying the long-term assets. C can be described as a company that has used a part of short-term funds for long-term purposes. Now, which is the healthiest of the three? As usual, give your answer in your mind and compare it later. Folks, don't forget, at the beginning of this video, I told you it is critical to remember that the liabilities finance the assets and the assets must generate the inflow to pay back the liabilities. Any mismatch will create a problem. We said, all right, if liabilities have to be paid back, but you do appreciate that some liabilities have to be paid back faster than others. And which liability has to be paid back fastest? Answer is short term. Which is why when I asked you to represent the balance sheet like this, what did we do? We isolated the short term sources and we clubbed the long term sources together. Now let's start with C. Who is going to come knocking on the doors of C in the very, very near future? Can I have my money back? How much will C be expected to pay? 30. This rule that I gave you said, when people come knocking on your doors, can I have my money back? At that point of time, for heaven's sake, ensure that there are doors available to you on the right hand side where you can go knocking. Can I have my money back so I can pay my liabilities? And on the right hand side, which asset will bring money back in the short period, short term or long term? Answer is short term. Folks, long term assets will never bring the money back, because long-term assets were not bought for sale, they were bought for use. And how will the short-term assets bring the money back? Because via the movement of the working capital cycle, every now and then cash is going to come back in the form of cash. How much cash is C expected to pay in the short period? 30. And how much cash can C generate in the short period? 20. How will they pay? Folks, when the short-term assets are insufficient to meet short-term liabilities, then organizations are forced to sell the long-term assets to pay short-term liabilities. And when you have to sell your buildings, your equipment, to pay who? A short-term liability? To me, that looks like the beginning of the end of that organization. C is in serious trouble. C is on the verge of insolvency. And why is C in serious trouble? Because C is guilty of having used short-term funds to acquire long-term assets. Don't ever do that. Whenever I address a room full of entrepreneurs, it could be one of the professional meeting, chambers of commerce meeting, my advice to them is, guys, immediately after this session, on your way home, I suggest drive past the market, acquire a slab of stone, get it engraved on that, a personal commitment that I will never use short-term money to buy long-term assets, and then go and install that stone somewhere where you get a chance to read it every day as a reminder. It is that important. Bring me 10 sick companies' balance sheets and probably 8 of them will look like this. So C is out. What does that leave us with? It leaves us with A and B. Now tell me which is better. Let me give you the rule for a healthy company. Rule for a healthy company is healthy organizations will ensure that they use long-term funds for long-term purposes, short-term funds for short-term purposes. Who has followed the rule to the T? A. Which is the best company? A has followed the rule. A is no doubt better than C, but B is even better than A. Now, why am I contradicting myself? I just told you the rule is healthy organizations use long term for long term, short term for short term. A has done exactly that. I've also said several times in the past that according to me, the mantra is less is bad, more is worse. A neither has less nor has more. Then why am I saying A is not the best, even though it's better than C? Reason is something else. Who's going to come knocking on the doors of A in the very, very near future? Can we have our money back? How much will they be expected to pay? 20. How much do they have in the form of short-term assets? 20. Epitome of efficiency. However, do you remember the breakup of the 20 on the asset side? Remember 3 items of working capital: cash, debtors, and inventory. Guys, when the creditors on the left side of the balance sheet, on the liability side of the balance sheet come knocking on your doors, can I have my money back? Probably the cash can be used to pay the creditors. Let's say even debtors can be used to pay the creditors. Debtors are people who owe you money. Creditors are people to whom you owe money. You can keep collecting from debtors and use that money to pay creditors. This organization can use cash to pay the creditors. They can use debtors to pay the creditors. But can they use inventory to pay the creditors? Answer is no. Why not? Guys, inventory is not in a liquid form. You don't know when it will get sold and when the money will come in. And besides, those creditors are the same people who supplied you this inventory. You went to them the other day, bought some material, promised I'll pay you next month. When I say use inventory to pay the creditor, what am I saying? You went to the vendor, give me material, I'll pay you next month. When the vendor came asking for money, you said, take your material back. You can't do that. I'm not here to play games. So guys, if the payables are 20 and your short-term assets are 20, but out of 20, a certain portion happens to be in the form of inventory, then you still don't have enough money to pay. And that brings me to a key accounting ratio. Those short-term uses on the right-hand side are called current assets. The short-term sources on the left-hand side are called current liabilities. And the ratio between current assets and current liabilities is called the current ratio. And the norm is healthy organizations will try and maintain a current ratio of about 2:1. Problem is A has a current ratio of 1:1. B has a current ratio of 2:1. C, of course, has a current ratio of 1 to 1.5. But the question is, can B also get into trouble? Answer is yes. How? The payables are 10, the short-term assets are 20, but the question still remains, what's the breakup? Guys, if inventory cannot be used to pay the creditors, then if you eliminate inventory, the remaining 2, cash plus debtors, should be at least equal to the current liabilities. So folks, the cash and debtors are called liquid current assets or quick assets. And inventory is illiquid. And healthy organizations will not only try and maintain a current ratio of 2:1, but within a current ratio 2:1, they must try and maintain a liquidity ratio, a quick ratio of minimum 1:1. That means if you ignore inventory, if your current liabilities are 10, then the cash plus debtors should be minimum 10. There'll be a problem if that is 8 instead of 10. The liquid assets are 8 and current liabilities are 10. They still won't be able to pay. And it will be better if liquid assets are slightly higher than liquid liability.